Chapter 1: The Betrayal. The heavy scent of roses and candle wax lingered in the grand hall of the Rossetti estate, but to Lena, it smelled of suffocation. Tonight was supposed to be hers. She stood at the top of the staircase, hands clenched at her sides, gazing down at the gilded ballroom. 100 guests were gathered, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, murmuring their approval of the engagement between Adrien Moreau, the most powerful man in the city, and the daughter of the Rossetti family. Except, it wasn't her. It was Celia. Lena's breath hitched as she took in the sight below. Her younger sister, wrapped in an opulent sapphire gown, stood beside Adrien, her hand resting lightly in his. That should have been me. Whispers coiled around her like smoke. Isn't Lena the eldest? Wasn't she meant to marry him? Celia is sweeter, easier to control. Adrien looks displeased. She didn't dare look at him, not yet. Instead, she turned to her father, standing tall with an expression of forced ease. Why? Her voice was sharp, barely above a whisper. Her father barely flinched. You were never suited for this marriage, Lena. You challenge too much. Adrien needs a wife who knows her place. Rage burned in her veins, but before she could lash out, her mother's cold voice cut in. Smile, she warned, lips barely moving. You will not ruin this family's reputation. Lena's nails dug into her palm as she swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal. This wasn't just about the marriage. It was about power, control. They had decided she was too much of a liability. Her gaze finally flickered to Adrien. For the first time, she allowed herself to meet his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that once made her breath hitch. He was watching her. No, studying her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there. Something dark, something restrained. For a single foolish second, she thought he would speak, that he would step forward, that he would stop this. But he didn't. The man she had been meant to marry merely tightened his grip on Celia's hand and turned away. Something inside Lena shattered. The world around her blurred. The whispers became a deafening roar in her ears. The glittering chandeliers, the silk and lace, the music. None of it mattered anymore. She had lost. But they had made a mistake. Because Lena Rossetti didn't break. She rebuilt. And one day they would regret ever underestimating her. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, out of the life that had been stolen from her. She disappeared into the night, and she did not look back. The whispers started the moment Lena Rossetti entered the ballroom. They traveled in hushed waves, rippling across the crowd like a storm on still water. She was supposed to be gone, forgotten. But there she was, tall, poised, and devastatingly untouchable, standing beneath the crystal chandeliers of a world that had once cast her aside. Draped in a sleek black gown that clung to her curves, Lena looked like sin wrapped in silk. Her chin lifted, her lips curved ever so slightly in amusement, but her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, betrayed nothing. And beside her, with a hand resting possessively on the small of her back, stood Damien Laurent, the man Adrien Moreau despised the most. Lena could feel Adrien's gaze on her before she even saw him. She turned, ever so slowly, and there he was, standing across the room like a shadow from her past. Adrien Moreau. The man who was supposed to be her husband. He hadn't changed. If anything, he looked colder, more dangerous. The crisp lines of his tailored suit, the effortless power in his stance, the piercing silver of his eyes, all of it sent a shiver down her spine. But it was the way he was looking at her that made her breath catch. Like he couldn't believe she was real. Like he hated that she was standing beside another man. Good. Lena held his gaze, letting the silence between them stretch. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Did he remember the girl who had once been meant for him? Or did he see the woman who had risen from the ashes of his betrayal? Damien leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. He's looking at you like he wants to set this entire room on fire. Lena let out a soft, knowing hum. Let him burn. Damien chuckled, dark and rich, as he tightened his grip on her waist. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Lena didn't answer, because the truth was she didn't know. The evening moved forward in a blur of murmured conversations and stolen glances, but every step Lena took, she could feel Adrien watching her. Not just watching, tracking her, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then it happened. She felt the shift in the air before she even turned, a looming presence behind her, a shadow falling over her skin. Leaving without saying hello, Lena's breath hitched. That voice. She turned slowly, and there he was. Adrian Moreau, standing just inches away, close enough that she could smell the faint, expensive spice of his cologne, close enough that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Lena arched a brow, feigning indifference. I didn't think pleasantries were necessary between us. Adrian's eyes darkened. You disappeared. She tilted her head. I didn't think you'd care. A muscle in his jaw ticked, and for the briefest second, something flashed across his face. Something raw, something dangerous. Then Damien's hand slid around her waist, effortlessly pulling her against him. Is there a problem here, Moreau? His voice was smooth, but the challenge in it was unmistakable. Adrian's gaze flicked to Damien. The tension between them was palpable, heavy enough to steal the air from the room. Lena watched, fascinated, as the two men sized each other up. The history between them was deeper than business rivalry. This was personal. Adrian's voice was dangerously low when he finally spoke. No problem at all. His eyes flicked back to Lena, his meaning unmistakable. This wasn't over. Not even close. Lena smiled, slow, taunting. Then she turned in Damien's arms, letting him lead her away. But as she walked, she felt it. Adrian's gaze still on her, burning into her skin. And deep inside, no matter how much she wanted to deny it, she felt something else too. Something she had no right to feel. Because Adrian Moreau was not hers to want. Not anymore. Chapter 3, Unfinished Business. The city shimmered outside the penthouse window, golden lights flickering like embers in the night. But Lena Rossetti wasn't admiring the view. She was thinking about Adrian Moreau. She hated that she was. Across the room, Damien Laurent poured himself a drink, watching her in that lazy, knowing way of his. You've been quiet since the gala, he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Let me guess, your old fiancé got under your skin. Lena turned from the window, schooling her features into indifference. You give him too much credit. Damien smirked, but there was something sharper behind it. I saw the way he looked at you, Lena, like he wanted to rip me apart with his bare hands. He took a slow sip. Can't say I blame him. Her stomach twisted. It doesn't matter, she said, brushing past him. I don't belong to him. I never did. But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure if she believed them. Lena knew it was reckless to be here, alone. Yet as she stepped into the dimly lit rooftop garden of Morrow Tower, she couldn't stop herself. The message had been simple. A single text, sent from a number she hadn't seen in years. Come. She should have ignored it, should have deleted it without a second thought. But Adrian had never been a man easily ignored. She found him standing near the edge, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom at his feet. He turned at the sound of her heels against the stone, his face unreadable. You came, he murmured. Lena crossed her arms, keeping her distance. Say what you need to say, Adrian. He studied her, his gaze tracing over her like he was memorizing every change, every piece of her that had hardened over the years. I never thought you'd come back. You never thought about me at all. She countered. Something in his expression flickered. You think that? Lena let out a cold laugh. You let my family throw me away like I was nothing, and you expect me to believe you cared? Adrian's jaw tightened. You don't know everything, Lena. Then enlighten me. She stepped closer, her voice a razor's edge. Tell me why you stood there that night and did nothing. Tell me why you let them replace me like I was disposable. The silence between them was thick, electric. Then, finally he spoke. I had no choice. Lena's breath caught. There's always a choice, Adrian. He shook his head. Not when your family held all the cards. Not when they made it clear. If I wanted to keep the Morrow Empire intact, I had to accept the change. Lena stiffened. You're lying. Am I? Adrian took a step closer, and suddenly the air between them felt charged, suffocating. Do you think I wanted Celia? That I wanted any of this? His voice dropped lower, rougher. It was always you, Lena. Her heart pounded. Then why didn't you fight for me? Adrian exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. Because I thought I could live without you. I thought I could forget. His eyes burned into hers, but I never did. The words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. Because the truth was, she had never forgotten either. Lena turned away, swallowing against the knot in her throat. It doesn't matter now. Adrian's fingers brushed against her wrist, barely there, but enough to make her pulse jump. Doesn't it? She forced herself to pull back. I'm married, Adrian. His expression darkened. To Damien. She lifted her chin. Yes. Adrian's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. Not at first. Then, finally, he's using you. Lena froze. What? Adrian's voice was steel. Damien doesn't love you, Lena. He never has. He's playing a game, one that ends with my downfall. She swallowed, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Adrian leaned in, his breath brushing against her ear. Be careful who you trust, amor. Her heart stuttered, and for the first time in years, Lena wasn't sure who was truly on her side. Chapter 4. A Game of Power and Secrets. The city was a battlefield, not one of blood and bullets, but of whispered deals, silent wars, and power shifting like sand beneath unsteady feet. Lena Rossetti had learned long ago that those who didn't play the game became pawns, and she would never be a pawn again. But after last night's conversation with Adrian Moreau, doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. Damien is using you. He never loved you. He's playing a game, one that ends with my downfall. The words haunted her. She wanted to believe they were nothing more than Adrian's desperation, a last attempt to sink his claws into her, but something about them wouldn't let go, and that terrified her. The Laurent estate was dark when Lena returned, the only light spilling from Damien's study. He was waiting. He always was. You were with him. Lena barely flinched at Damien's voice as she stepped inside. He was seated behind his desk, his fingers resting loosely against a crystal glass of whiskey. She held his gaze, refusing to look away. Were you waiting up for me? He smirked, slow and deliberate. I was waiting to see if you'd come home. Lena walked forward, placing her hands on the edge of the desk. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were jealous. Damien chuckled, standing in one fluid motion. He closed the space between them, his fingers brushing lightly against her jaw before tilting her chin up. I don't get jealous, mon amour, but I do hate seeing my wife tangled up in a man who doesn't deserve her. She didn't react to his touch, didn't let herself soften. And you do? His grip tightened, just for a second. You tell me. The weight of his stare was suffocating, but Lena was no stranger to suffocation. You're hiding something from me, she said finally, stepping out of his reach. Damien sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. We all have our secrets, darling. Even you. A flicker of something sharp passed between them. She thought of Adrian, of what he'd said. And for the first time, she asked herself a question she had never dared to before. Why had Damien really married her? Lena knew better than to ask Damien for the truth. If she wanted answers, she'd have to find them herself. That was how she found herself in his private study at 3 a.m, sifting through files she had never been meant to see. Her heart pounded as she flipped through documents, ledgers, business transactions, all the things that made up Damien Laurent's empire. But it wasn't until she found the old newspaper clippings that her blood turned to ice. Moreau shipping empire faces collapse after unidentified betrayal. Unconfirmed reports suggest internal sabotage. Who took down the Moreau dynasty? Lena inhaled sharply as realization settled like lead in her stomach. This wasn't just a rivalry. It had never been. Damien wasn't simply Adrian's enemy. He had been the one to destroy him. And now, she was his wife. Her hands trembled as she reached for the last piece of paper, tucked away like a forgotten relic. A photograph. Her father, standing beside Damien, a cold, paralyzing dread spread through her veins. Her family had been part of Adrian's downfall. A sharp inhale behind her made her freeze. Slowly, she turned. Damien stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his voice, when he spoke, was dangerously soft. I was hoping you wouldn't find that. Lena's pulse thundered. How long were you going to keep this from me? Damien stepped forward, his face shrouded in shadow. Does it matter? You married me to punish him. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the accusation cut deep. Damien exhaled, his gaze dark and unreadable. It was never just about him. Lena stared at him, anger and something dangerously close to betrayal swelling in her chest. Then what was it about? Silence. Damien reached for her, but this time she stepped back. For the first time since she had returned, Lena realized the truth. She wasn't just caught between two men. She was caught between two wars. And she wasn't sure who the real enemy was anymore. Chapter 5. The Trap Tightens. The world as Lena Rossetti knew it had just shifted beneath her feet. She sat alone in the darkened study, her fingers still clutching the damning newspaper clippings. The truth lay before her, cold, undeniable, and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Damien hadn't just been Adrian's rival. He had been the one to orchestrate his downfall, and her family had been part of it. The weight of it settled deep in her chest, suffocating. Had her father sold her into this marriage to atone for his betrayal? Or had he done it to tighten his grip on the power they had stolen from Adrian? Her mind spun with questions, but before she could make sense of them, the door creaked open. Damien stepped inside, his silhouette framed in the dim light. "You shouldn't have gone digging, mon amour." Lena's grip on the papers tightened. "And you shouldn't have lied to me." A slow exhale. "I never lied." She let out a bitter laugh. "Omission is just a more elegant way of deceiving someone." Damien moved closer, his presence a quiet storm. "And what would you have done if you'd known from the start? Run straight into Adrian's arms?" Lena didn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't know. Damien reached for her chin, tilting it up with gentle but firm fingers. "This game is bigger than us, chérie." "It always has been." She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "And what am I to you, Damien? A piece on your chessboard? Another way to twist the knife in Adrian's back?" His lips parted, but for once, he didn't have a smooth answer, and that silence told her everything. Lena pulled away. "I need air." Damien let her go, but she could feel his eyes on her as she walked away. The city streets were empty when Lena slipped outside, the cold air biting against her skin. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away. Her feet carried her to a place she hadn't meant to go. Morrow Tower. Lena's pulse pounded as she stood before the looming skyscraper, its dark glass reflecting the city lights. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. She stepped inside. The building was quieter at night, the usual swarm of employees reduced to only a few lingering figures. They barely spared her a glance. They still remembered who she was. She found Adrian in his private office, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a drink in his hand. He didn't turn, but she knew he had sensed her. "You shouldn't be here." Lena crossed the room, her heart hammering. "I need answers." A slow sip of whiskey. "So you finally started asking the right questions." She clenched her fists. "My family was involved, wasn't it?" Adrian turned then, his silver eyes dark with something unreadable. "They didn't just betray me, Lena." He took a step closer. "They betrayed you." The words cut deeper than she expected. "You're lying," she whispered. He tilted his head. "Am I?" Adrian reached into his desk and pulled out a file, tossing it onto the polished surface between them. "Go ahead. Read it." Lena hesitated, then slowly reached for the folder. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Financial records, hidden agreements, and at the center of it all, a contract bearing her father's signature. A deal, one that ensured the Lawrence would back the Rossetti family, but only if Lena was married to Damien. Her entire marriage had been a transaction. A wave of nausea rolled through her. This can't be real. Adrian's voice was quiet, lethal. "They sold you to the enemy, Lena." Her breath hitched. She had always known her father was ruthless, but she had never imagined, never allowed herself to believe that he had used her as a bargaining chip. Adrian stepped closer, his voice a low murmur. "Tell me, do you still think Damien is the one protecting you?" Lena squeezed her eyes shut, her mind a whirlwind of doubts, betrayals, and half-truths. Adrian's fingers ghosted along her wrist, barely there, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. "You were mine first, Lena." His voice was softer now, something almost raw beneath it. "You still are." Lena's eyes flew open, locking onto his, and for the first time in years, she felt something she had sworn to bury. A pull, a longing, a dangerous, undeniable truth. But before she could speak, before she could untangle the mess of emotions inside her, a sharp knock shattered the moment. One of Adrian's men entered, his expression tense. "Sir, we have a problem." Adrian's gaze hardened. "What is it?" The man hesitated, then looked at Lena. "It's about Damien Laurent." Lena's blood ran cold. And just like that, she realized the trap wasn't just tightening around her. It was about to snap shut. And that was part one. Things are only getting more complicated, and the real drama is just beginning. If you're hooked and want to find out what happens next, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss part two of this story. Trust me, you won't want to miss the secrets, betrayals, and shocking twists still to come. See you in part two.